The lingering scent of wildflowers mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil as Hazel Montgomery knelt before the crude wooden cross marking her father's grave. Her shoulders trembled with each sob that racked her body, tears falling freely onto the dusty ground of the Sweetwater Cemetery. Spring of 1875 had brought new life to the Texas plains, but for Hazel, it had only brought more sorrow. Through her tears, she barely registered the sound of approaching hoofbeats until they stopped nearby. She didn't look up, didn't care who might be witnessing her moment of grief. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill overlooking the small but growing town of Sweetwater, and visitors weren't uncommon. All she wanted was to be left alone with her memories and regrets. The crunch of boots on gravel grew closer, then stopped. From the corner of her eye, Hazel noticed a tall figure standing respectfully at a distance. When she finally glanced up, she saw a man she didn't recognize, a stranger in this town where she knew nearly everyone. He held his hat in his hands, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His clothing was trail-worn but clean denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. Most surprising were the wildflowers clutched in his hand, the same purple and yellow blooms that grew along the creek bed where she'd collected her own bouquet earlier that morning. "Beg your pardon, madam," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Didn't mean to intrude on your grief." Hazel quickly wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. "You're not intruding, it's a public cemetery." The stranger nodded, then approached the neighboring grave, one Hazel knew well. It belonged to old Mrs. Jenkins, who'd passed the previous winter. To Hazel's surprise, the man carefully placed his flowers on the weathered grave, then removed his hat and bowed his head. After a respectful moment of silence, he spoke without looking at Hazel. "My grandmother always said nobody should rest without flowers to brighten their journey." "That's a kind sentiment," Hazel replied, her voice still thick with emotion. "Did you know Mrs. Jenkins?" "No, madam," he admitted. "But I saw you had flowers for your loved one, and this grave here looked like it could use some too." The simple kindness of the gesture caused fresh tears to well in Hazel's eyes. For the first time in days, these weren't entirely tears of sorrow. "I'm Vaughn," he said, finally turning to face her properly. "Vaughn Blackwood." "Hazel Montgomery," she replied, noticing now the intensity of his eyes, deep blue like the evening sky just after sunset. "You're new to Sweetwater." "Just passing through," Vaughn confirmed. "Been working cattle drives north to Kansas, but thought I might stay a while if there's work to be found." Hazel nodded absently, her attention returning to her father's grave. "There's always work for capable men." She traced her fingers along the rough-hewn cross. "My father would have hired you. He was always taking in strays, people and animals alike." "Sounds like a good man," Vaughn said, remaining where he stood, giving her space. "The best," Hazel whispered. "And now he's gone because of me." The words had slipped out unbidden, and she immediately regretted them. This stranger didn't need to hear her guilt and regrets. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably, but didn't leave. Instead, he lowered himself to sit on a nearby stone, still keeping a respectful distance. "Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who doesn't know all the details," he offered. No judgment from a stranger passing through. Hazel looked up at him, studying his face. There was something open and honest in his expression that made her want to trust him, despite having just met. Perhaps it was precisely because he was a stranger that she felt she could speak freely. "My father was the sheriff," she began hesitantly. "2 weeks ago, a group of outlaws came through town. They robbed the bank and—" her voice faltered. "Pa tried to stop them. I was at the general store across the street. I saw it happen. I couldn't do anything but watch as they gunned him down in the street." Vaughn's expression remained steady, though his eyes reflected genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Montgomery. No one should have to witness such a thing." "The worst part is that I recognized one of them," Hazel continued, the words tumbling out now. "An old friend who left town years ago. He saw me too, just for a moment before they rode off. If I'd called out to him, maybe things would have ended differently." "Or maybe you'd be lying beside your pa now," Vaughn said gently. "You can't know how it might have turned out." "That's what everyone says," Hazel replied, "but it doesn't ease the guilt." They sat in silence for a long moment, the spring breeze rustling through the tall grass that grew between the graves. "How long ago did you lose your folks?" Hazel asked eventually, sensing somehow that Vaughn understood grief in a personal way. A shadow crossed his face. "Ma died when I was 12. Fever took her quick. Pa lasted another 6 years before his heart gave out. Been on my own since I was 18. "I'm sorry," Hazel said, realizing she wasn't the only one carrying loss. Vaughn shrugged. "It was years ago now." "The sharp edges of grief dull with time, Miss Montgomery. Doesn't go away entirely, but it changes. Becomes something you can carry without it crushing you." The simple wisdom of his words resonated with Hazel. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a tiny glimmer of hope that perhaps the overwhelming pain wouldn't always feel so consuming. "Do you have family here in town?" Vaughn asked. Hazel shook her head. "No, Pa was all I had. I'm staying at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house until I decide what to do next. The ranch is too quiet without him." "A ranch, you say?" Vaughn's interest seemed piqued. "The Double M, about 5 miles east of town. Nothing grand, but Pa built it from nothing." Pride briefly replaced the sorrow in her voice. "We run about 200 head of cattle and keep a few horses. Who's looking after it now? Our foreman, Hank, and the 2 ranch hands we could afford to keep on. They're good men, but—" She trailed off, the weight of her uncertain future pressing down once again. Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. "A working ranch needs more than 3 men. "I know," Hazel sighed. "But with Pa gone, I'm not sure I can keep it going. The bank's already making noises about the mortgage." A comfortable silence fell between them again. Hazel was surprised to find herself opening up to this stranger, but there was something reassuring about his presence. Perhaps it was because he asked no questions about her future plans, offered no unsolicited advice. He simply listened. The sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Hazel knew she should head back to town before dark, but found herself reluctant to leave. "Would you like me to walk you back to town, Miss Montgomery?" Vaughn finally asked, seeming to sense her dilemma. "That's kind of you, Mr. Blackwood, but I have my horse tied up by the gate." She gathered herself to stand, brushing dirt from her skirt. Vaughn rose and offered his hand to help her up. His palm was rough with calluses, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living. There was a gentle strength in his grip as he steadied her. "If you're looking for work, Mr. Blackwood," Hazel found herself saying, "you might stop by the Double M tomorrow. I can't promise anything permanent, but we could use an extra hand, even if just for a while." Something brightened in Vaughn's eyes. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Montgomery. I just might do that." As they walked toward the cemetery gate, Hazel turned for one last look at her father's grave. The wildflowers she'd placed there earlier swayed gently in the breeze, a splash of color against the somber earth. "He would have liked the flowers," Vaughn said quietly. Hazel looked up at him, surprised by the insight. "Yes," she agreed. "He always said there wasn't enough beauty in this harsh land, and we should appreciate it where we find it." For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in 2 weeks, Hazel felt her lips curve into the slightest smile. It was small and fleeting, but it was there. If Vaughn noticed, he made no comment, but something in his expression softened as he helped her mount her horse. "Until tomorrow, Miss Montgomery," he said, stepping back and placing his hat back on his head. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, turning her horse toward town. As she rode away, Hazel couldn't help but glance back once. Vaughn still stood by the cemetery gate, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. There was something comforting in knowing he'd stayed, watching to make sure she departed safely. For the first time since her father's death, Hazel felt something other than grief. She couldn't name it exactly, not hope, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative step toward whatever came after sorrow. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that normally would have lifted Hazel's spirits. She dressed carefully in her riding clothes, a practical split skirt and sturdy blouse, before heading down to Mrs. Holloway's dining room for breakfast. "Good morning, dear," the elderly widow greeted her. "You're up early today." "I thought I'd ride out to the ranch," Hazel explained, accepting a cup of coffee. "See how things are going." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "That's good. Getting back to routine helps with grief, or so I found after Mr. Holloway passed." Hazel sipped her coffee, wondering if Vaughn Blackwood would actually appear at the ranch as discussed. She hadn't mentioned him to Mrs. Holloway, knowing how quickly gossip spread in a small town like Sweetwater. The last thing she needed was speculation about her hiring a handsome drifter she'd met at the cemetery. After breakfast, Hazel saddled her mare Penny and rode toward the Double M. The familiar landscape brought both comfort and pain. These were the trails she'd ridden with her father countless times, learning the ranching business at his side. Sheriff James Montgomery had never treated his daughter as less capable, because of her sex. When Hazel's mother died during a harsh winter when Hazel was just 10 years old, he'd stepped up to raise his daughter alone, teaching her everything he knew about horses, cattle, and the land they called home. He'd served as sheriff in town while building the ranch, eventually retiring from law enforcement 5 years ago to focus solely on the Double M. Now, at 22, Hazel had the knowledge to run the ranch, but doubted whether the bank or the local ranchers would take a young woman seriously as a property owner and cattle rancher. As she approached the ranch, the familiar sight of the weathered barn and modest ranch house sent a pang through her heart. She hadn't been back since the funeral, choosing instead to stay in town rather than face the emptiness of the house without her father. Hank Owens, their foreman for the past decade, emerged from the barn as she dismounted. His weathered face broke into a relieved smile at the sight of her. "Miss Hazel, good to see you back home," he said, taking Penny's reins. "Just visiting today, Hank," she corrected him gently. "How are things?" Hank's expression grew serious. "Managing as best we can, Miss Hazel, but 3 men can only do so much. The south fence line needs repair, and we've got calving season coming up." Hazel nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "I'm working on it, Hank. In fact, there might be someone coming by today looking for work. A Mr. Blackwood." Hank raised an eyebrow. "You've been interviewing hands in town." "Not exactly," Hazel replied, unwilling to explain the cemetery meeting. "He's passing through, experienced with cattle. I thought we could use the help, even temporarily." Before Hank could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Vaughn Blackwood rode into the yard on a sturdy bay gelding, looking more put together than he had the previous day. He'd clearly made an effort to clean up, his dark hair still damp from washing. "Miss Montgomery," he greeted her, tipping his hat before dismounting. "Hope I'm not too early." "Not at all, Mr. Blackwood," Hazel replied, aware of Hank's curious gaze bouncing between them. "This is Hank Owens, our foreman. Hank, this is Vaughn Blackwood." The 2 men sized each other up as they shook hands. Hank, like most foremen, was protective of both the ranch and Hazel herself. "Where are you from, Blackwood?" Hank asked, his tone neutral but watchful. "Originally Missouri," Vaughn answered easily. "Been working my way west for the past few years. Last job was a cattle drive up to Dodge City." Hank nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "Know your way around cattle, then?" "Yes, sir. Grew up on a small farm, worked ranch hands since I was 16. Can break horses too if needed." "We might take you up on that," Hank said. "Got a couple of 3-year-olds that need finishing." He glanced at Hazel. "If Miss Hazel's hiring, that is." All eyes turned to Hazel, putting her in the uncomfortable position of making a decision she hadn't fully thought through. The truth was, they desperately needed help, but with the ranch's finances already stretched thin, taking on another salary seemed risky. "I can work for room and board until you see if I'm worth a wage," Vaughn offered, seeming to read her hesitation. "No point paying a man before you know his worth." The generous offer surprised both Hazel and Hank. It wasn't common for a capable-looking cowboy to work without immediate pay. "That's not necessary, Mr. Blackwood," Hazel began, but Vaughn cut her off gently. "It's a fair arrangement, Miss Montgomery. I need somewhere to stay, you need help. We can reassess in a week or 2. Hank gave a short nod of approval. "Man's talking sense, Miss Hazel." After a moment's consideration, Hazel agreed. "All right, Mr. Blackwood, we can start on that basis. There's a bunkhouse behind the barn where you can stay." "Much obliged," Vaughn replied with a slight smile. "Where do you want me to start?" Hank immediately took charge. "South fence line needs mending. I'll round up the tools and show you where." As the men headed toward the barn, Hazel called after them. "I'll be in the house if you need me, Hank." Walking into her childhood home alone was harder than Hazel had anticipated. Everything remained exactly as it had been: her father's boots by the door, his favorite chair angled toward the fireplace, his pipe resting on the mantel. She ran her fingers over the familiar objects, memories flooding back with each touch. For the next few hours, Hazel busied herself with household tasks that had been neglected since her father's death. She aired out rooms, dusted furniture, and took stock of supplies. The physical labor helped keep her mind occupied, though occasionally she found herself pausing at a window, watching the distant figures of the men working on the fence line. Even from a distance, Vaughn's tall form was distinctive. He worked steadily alongside Hank and the other hands, showing no hesitation about tackling the difficult labor. Hazel couldn't help but wonder about him: what circumstances had led him to Sweetwater, and why he'd stopped at the cemetery yesterday. By mid-afternoon, Hazel had prepared a large pot of beef stew using preserved vegetables from the root cellar. She was setting the table when Hank entered the kitchen, removing his hat respectfully. "Men are washing up for dinner," he announced. "That new hand's a good worker, Miss Hazel. Knows what he's doing." "I'm glad to hear it," Hazel replied, relieved that her instinct about Vaughn seemed to be proving correct. "There's something else," Hank said, his expression growing serious. "Banker Simmons rode out while you were in the house, wanted to talk to you about the mortgage." Hazel's hands stilled. "What did he say?" "Same as before. Payments due end of month and they're not inclined to extend." The reminder of their precarious financial situation dampened Hazel's momentary optimism. "Did you tell him I'd come see him?" Hank nodded. "Said you'd be in town tomorrow or the next day." "Thank you, Hank." Hazel tried to keep her voice steady. "Let's not worry the others with this just yet." The kitchen door opened again, admitting the other ranch hands: Tobias, a weathered cowboy in his 50s who'd been with them for years, young Miguel, who joined them last spring, and finally Vaughn, who had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. Dinner was a more animated affair than Hazel had expected. The men, tired but satisfied from a productive day's work, shared stories and gentle teasing. Vaughn fit in surprisingly well, offering anecdotes from his travels that had even taciturned Tobias chuckling. "So there I was," Vaughn was saying, "halfway up this canyon wall, chasing after a stray calf that had somehow climbed up there, when I disturbed what must have been the largest hornet nest in all of Texas." The men laughed as he described his frantic descent, calf tucked under one arm while being pursued by an angry swarm. Hazel found herself smiling despite her worries, caught up in the warmth of community that had been missing from her life these past weeks. After dinner, while the other men retired to the bunkhouse, Vaughn lingered to help Hazel clear the table, an unexpected gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Hank, who raised an eyebrow before bidding them good night. "You don't have to help," Hazel protested mildly as Vaughn gathered plates. "My ma would tan my hide, even from the grave, if I left a woman to clean up after I'd eaten my fill," he replied with a smile. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Vaughn spoke again. "It's a good outfit you have here, Miss Montgomery. Hank runs a tight operation." "He's been with us since I was 12, Hazel said, "more family than employee at this point." "I can tell he cares about you," Vaughn observed. "They all do." Hazel nodded, touched by the loyalty her father had inspired in their small crew. "Pa always said if you treat men fairly, they'll return it tenfold. Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Hazel agreed, her throat tightening. "Too wise to have left the ranch in such a precarious position." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Vaughn paused in drying a plate, his expression concerned. "Forgive me for asking, but is the ranch in trouble?" Hazel hesitated, then decided there was no harm in being honest. "The mortgage payment is due at the end of the month." Pa had been counting on the spring cattle sale to cover it, but with him gone. She trailed off, not wanting to burden this newcomer with their financial woes. "How many head were you planning to drive to market?" Vaughn asked. 50, maybe 60, Hazel replied. "We've got the stock, but not enough hands to drive them safely." Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. 4 men could do it if they're experienced. 5 would be better." "Even if we could," Hazel sighed, "the cattle aren't quite market ready." Pa was planning to fatten them on the north pasture for another 2 weeks before the drive. 2 weeks isn't much time, but it might be enough, Vaughn mused. When exactly is the payment due? The 28th, Hazel said. Just over 3 weeks from now. Vaughn finished drying the last plate and set it carefully on the shelf. Miss Montgomery, I don't mean to overstep, but I've led cattle drives before. If you're willing to trust me, I believe we could make this work. Hazel studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Why would you help us, Mr. Blackwood? You barely know me or this ranch. Vaughn met her gaze steadily. Maybe I know what it's like to lose something that matters, or maybe I just believe a daughter should have the chance to honor her father's legacy. He paused, then added quietly, and perhaps I haven't found many worthy causes to fight for in my travels. There was something in his eyes, a sincerity that Hazel couldn't dismiss. Against her better judgment, she found herself wanting to trust him. I'll think about it, she promised. But first, I need to speak with the bank tomorrow. Fair enough, Vaughn agreed. Whatever you decide, I'll help however I can while I'm here. As Vaughn bid her goodnight and headed toward the bunkhouse, Hazel remained in the kitchen, mulling over their conversation. She barely knew this man, yet something told her he might be exactly what the double M needed in this desperate hour. More troubling was the way her heart had quickened when he looked at her with those intense blue eyes. Grief and attraction were a dangerous combination, she reminded herself. Whatever decisions she made needed to be for the good of the ranch, not based on the unexpected warmth she felt in Vaughn Blackwood's presence. The next morning, Hazel rode into Sweetwater with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her father's death. She'd spent a restless night considering Vaughn's suggestion about the cattle drive, and while she wasn't ready to commit to such a risky plan, she needed to know exactly where the ranch stood with the bank. First National Bank of Sweetwater occupied a prominent corner of Main Street, its stone facade designed to project stability and permanence. Hazel tied Penny to the hitching post and straightened her skirt before ascending the steps. Inside, the teller directed her to Harold Simmons' office at the rear of the building. The banker, a portly man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, rose from behind his desk as she entered. Miss Montgomery, what a pleasant surprise, he greeted her, though his expression suggested it was anything but. Please have a seat, Mr. Simmons, Hazel acknowledged, sitting in the offered chair. I understand you came to the ranch yesterday. Yes, indeed. Simmons settled back into his seat. I was hoping to speak with you about your father's outstanding loan. That's why I'm here, Hazel said, meeting his gaze directly. I want to be clear about the terms and our options. Simmons cleared his throat, shuffling papers on his desk. The situation is quite straightforward, Miss Montgomery. Your father borrowed against the property to expand his herd 3 years ago. The terms were 5 years of monthly payments, with a larger payment due each spring after the cattle sale. And we've never missed a payment, Hazel pointed out. True, Simmons conceded. However, your father's untimely death, my sincere condolences, by the way, has created some concerns for the bank. What concerns? Hazel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Simmons adjusted his spectacles nervously. Well, to be frank, Miss Montgomery, a ranch requires strong management. Your father was a respected cattleman. Without him, the bank must consider whether the loan remains a sound investment. The implication was clear, and it stoked a fire in Hazel's chest. I've worked that ranch alongside my father since I was a child, Mr. Simmons. I know every acre, every head of cattle, every aspect of the operation. I don't doubt your enthusiasm, Simmons said delicately, but ranching is a man's business, Miss Montgomery. The physical demands alone, I employ capable men for the physical labor, just as my father did, Hazel interrupted, keeping her voice level despite her rising anger. My concern is with the business itself, which I am entirely capable of managing. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. Nevertheless, the bank's position is that without your father's oversight, the risk has increased. We're prepared to accept the full spring payment as agreed, but we're also considering calling in the remainder of the loan after that. Hazel felt as though she'd been struck. That wasn't the agreement. We have 2 more years on the loan terms. Yes, well, there are provisions for reassessment in the event of the primary borrower's death, Simmons explained, not quite meeting her eyes. It's standard practice. May I see this provision? Hazel asked, extending her hand. Simmons reluctantly produced the loan documents, pointing to a clause in small print. Hazel read it carefully, her heart sinking as she realized he was technically correct. The bank had the right to reevaluate the loan in the event of her father's death. So if I make the spring payment on time, what then? She asked, keeping her voice steady. The bank's directors will meet to discuss the remaining balance, Simmons said, if you can demonstrate that the ranch remains viable under your stewardship. They may consider continuing with the original terms. It wasn't much, but it was something. Hazel nodded slowly. Then I'll make the payment on the 28th as agreed, and I'll prepare documentation showing the ranch's productivity and prospects. Simmons looked surprised, perhaps having expected her to crumble under the pressure. Very well, Miss Montgomery, we'll look forward to receiving your payment. As Hazel left the bank, her mind raced with calculations. They had the cattle to make the payment, but only if they could get them to market in time. Vaughn's suggestion suddenly seemed less like a risk and more like their only viable option. Lost in thought, she nearly collided with Sheriff Daniels on the boardwalk. "Whoa there, Miss Montgomery," the sheriff said, steadying her. "You seem in a mighty hurry." "Sorry, Sheriff," Hazel apologized. "I was distracted." Sheriff Daniels, who had been her father's deputy before taking over the badge, regarded her sympathetically. "How are you holding up, Hazel?" "We all miss your pa something fierce around here." "Taking it day by day," she replied honestly. "The ranch keeps me busy," the sheriff nodded. "That's good, work helps." He hesitated, then added, "I've been meaning to ride out and talk to you. There's been some news about the gang that—" He trailed off, not wanting to say it directly. Hazel's attention sharpened immediately. "What news?" "Word is they hit a bank in Presidio last week. Same method, same description." The sheriff lowered his voice. "I've been in contact with Rangers. They're on the trail." "Did you tell them what I told you?" Hazel asked. "About recognizing one of them," Sheriff Daniels nodded. "Passed along the description of Liam Reeves, just as you said. They're particularly interested in him, being from these parts originally." The mention of Liam's name sent a wave of complicated emotions through Hazel. They'd grown up together, been childhood friends until he'd left town at 18 after a dispute with his father. She never imagined he'd return as part of an outlaw gang or that he'd be complicit in her father's murder. "If they catch them," Hazel began, "justice will be served," the sheriff assured her firmly. "Your pa deserves nothing less." Hazel thanked him for the information and continued on her way, her mind now even more troubled. The need to save the ranch had taken on additional urgency, not just to preserve her father's legacy, but to ensure she remained in Sweetwater to see justice done when Liam and his gang were finally caught. By the time she reached the general store to purchase supplies, Hazel had made her decision. They would drive the cattle to market, and they would do it in time to make the payment. She wouldn't let her father's killers take anything else from her, not his ranch, not his reputation, and not the future he'd worked so hard to build. As she loaded her purchases onto Penny, Hazel caught sight of a familiar figure emerging from the gunsmith shop across the street. Vaughn saw her at the same moment and tipped his hat in greeting before crossing to join her. "Miss Montgomery," he said, helping her secure a sack of flour to her saddle. "Fancy meeting you in town." "I could say the same, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, noticing he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you'd be at the ranch today." "Hank sent me for some supplies," Vaughn explained, holding up the package. "New sights for his rifle. The old ones were shot." Hazel nodded, then lowered her voice. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the cattle drive." Interest flickered in Vaughn's eyes. "And we'll need to move quickly," Hazel said. "The cattle need at least 10 more days on the north pasture to be market-ready, which leaves very little time for the drive itself." A slow smile spread across Vaughn's face. "So you're going through with it?" "Yes," Hazel confirmed. "But I'll need your help convincing Hank. He's protective and might not like risking so much on a rushed drive." "Leave Hank to me," Vaughn assured her. "Between the two of us, we can make him see it's the best option." They agreed to discuss the details that evening and parted ways Vaughn to finish his errands, and Hazel to head back to the ranch. As she rode, Hazel couldn't help but marvel at how quickly Vaughn Blackwood had gone from stranger to confidant. There was something about him that inspired trust, despite the lingering questions about his past and his reasons for staying in Sweetwater. More troubling was the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near. Grief had left her vulnerable, she reminded herself. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for a drifter who would likely move on once the cattle drive was complete. Yet as she approached the Double M, Hazel couldn't deny the small flutter of anticipation at the thought of seeing him again that evening. For the first time since her father's death, she found herself looking forward to something, and that alone felt like a step toward healing. That evening after dinner, Hazel, Vaughn, and Hank gathered in the ranch house parlor to discuss the cattle drive plan. Hank, as expected, was skeptical. "It's cutting it mighty close, Miss Hazel," he warned, pacing before the fireplace. "Even if we start moving them to market in 2 weeks, that leaves barely enough time to make the payment." "I know it's tight," Hazel acknowledged, "but Mr. Blackwood has experience leading drives, and we only need to get them to Abilene. The railroad can take them from there." Hank turned his attention to Vaughn. "How many drives have you led, Blackwood?" "3 from Texas to Kansas," Vaughn replied evenly. "2 more from Missouri to Wyoming territory. Never lost more than 5 head on any drive." The statistics were impressive, even Hank had to admit. "And you think we can do this with just the 5 of us?" "It won't be easy," Vaughn conceded, "but it's doable if the weather holds and we stick to the eastern route. Less chance of trouble from rustlers that way." Hank considered this, then looked to Hazel. "What did the bank say?" Hazel shared the details of her conversation with Simmons, including the threat to call in the remainder of the loan. As she spoke, she noticed Vaughn's jaw tightening, a flash of anger in his eyes at the banker's treatment of her. "That weasel," Hank muttered when she finished. "Your pa would have run him out of town for talking to you that way." "Be that as it may," Hazel replied pragmatically, "we need to make this payment on time, and we need to prove the ranch is still viable. A successful cattle drive accomplishes both." After further discussion of the logistics, Hank finally nodded his agreement. "All right, we'll do it your way, but I want those cattle on the north pasture for at least 10 more days. No point driving skinny beeves to market they won't fetch half what they're worth." "Agreed," Hazel said. "We'll move them to the north pasture tomorrow, then prepare for the drive. Mr. Blackwood, can you help Hank plan the route?" "Of course," Vaughn agreed. "We should also take inventory of supplies and equipment. A drive like this requires careful preparation." As the men continued discussing details, Hazel found herself watching Vaughn with growing admiration. He spoke with quiet authority about the cattle business, deferring to Hank's knowledge of local conditions while contributing his broader experience. Whatever his past, he clearly knew ranching. When Hank finally retired for the night, Vaughn remained in the parlor with Hazel. The lamp cast a warm glow over the room, softening the hard edges of the day's worries. "Thank you," Hazel said simply, "for helping convince Hank and for offering your expertise." Vaughn shook his head. "No need for thanks. It's a good plan and I'm glad to be useful." "Still," Hazel insisted, "you didn't have to get involved in our problems. Most drifters would have moved on by now." A thoughtful expression crossed Vaughn's face. "Maybe I'm tired of drifting." The quiet admission hung in the air between them, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. Hazel found herself wondering what it would be like if Vaughn Blackwood decided to stay at the Double M permanently, not just as a hand, but perhaps as something more. The thought startled her and she quickly pushed it aside. "It's getting late," she said, rising from her chair. "We have an early start tomorrow." Vaughn stood as well, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. "Indeed we do. Good night, Miss Montgomery." "Hazel," she corrected impulsively. "If we're going to work together on this drive, you might as well call me Hazel." A smile touched his lips. "Good night, Hazel, and you should call me Vaughn." "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. As she watched him walk toward the door, Hazel called out, "Vaughn, may I ask you something?" He turned, one hand on the doorknob. "Of course." "Why were you really at the cemetery that day? You said you didn't know anyone in town." Vaughn was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "My mother always taught me to pay respects when passing a cemetery," he finally said. "She believed the dead get lonely if no one visits them." He paused, then added softly, "And perhaps I recognized something in you that day, a grief I understood all too well." Before Hazel could respond, he tipped his hat and slipped out into the night, leaving her with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense that fate had brought Vaughn Blackwood to her cemetery that day for a reason that was only beginning to unfold. The next 10 days passed in a flurry of activity as the Double M prepared for the cattle drive. Hazel found herself working from sunrise to sunset alongside the men, inspecting the herd, repairing equipment, and ensuring supplies were adequate for the journey. Vaughn proved himself invaluable during this time. His experience with cattle drives brought a level of organization and foresight that even Hank came to appreciate. He helped train Miguel in the particular skills needed for a drive, worked with Tobias to ensure the chuck wagon was properly outfitted, and spent hours with Hank plotting the most efficient route to Abilene. More than once, Hazel found herself pausing in her work to watch Vaughn as he moved among the cattle or demonstrated a technique to Miguel. There was a natural grace to his movements, a quiet confidence that drew the eye. Occasionally, he would catch her watching and offer a small smile that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. On the evening before they were to move the cattle from the north pasture and begin the drive, Hazel sat on the porch, reviewing her calculations. If all went well, they would reach Abilene with 3 days to spare before the bank payment was due. She'd then take the train back to Sweetwater while the men returned with the wagon and horses. The sound of boots on the porch steps drew her attention. Vaughn approached, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Hazel before settling into the chair beside her. "Everything's ready," he reported. "Chuck wagon's packed, horses are selected, and the men know their roles. We'll head out at first light." "Thank you," Hazel said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I couldn't have organized all this without your help." Vaughn shrugged off the praise. "You'd have managed. You know this ranch better than anyone." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching as the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, the cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the journey that lay ahead. "It's beautiful here," Vaughn observed. "I can see why your father chose this land." "He always said the sunsets alone were worth the mortgage payments," Hazel replied with a sad smile. "He loved this place." "And you, do you love it too?" Hazel considered the question seriously. "I do. It's not just land and cattle to me, it's home. Every fence post, every creek bed, every rise and fall of the hills. They're part of me." She paused, then admitted, "That's why I can't bear the thought of losing it." Vaughn nodded, understanding. "Some places get into your blood that way. I haven't felt that connection since my parents' farm was sold after Pa died." "Is that why you started drifting?" Hazel asked gently. "Partly," Vaughn acknowledged. "Without the farm, there wasn't much reason to stay in Missouri, so I headed west looking for something," he smiled ruefully. "Still not sure what." "And have you found it?" Hazel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vaughn turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "I'm beginning to think I might have." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Hazel was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of leather and pine, the strength in his hands as they cradled the coffee cup, the quiet steadiness that had become her anchor in these turbulent weeks. Before either could speak again, Hank's voice called from the barn, breaking the moment. "Vaughn, need your help with this harness." Vaughn stood reluctantly. "Duty calls," he said with a small smile. "Vaughn," Hazel said impulsively, reaching out to touch his arm. "Whatever happens with this drive, thank you for being here when I needed someone." He covered her hand with his own briefly. "I'm glad I was there that day at the cemetery, Hazel, more glad than you know." As he walked toward the barn, Hazel remained on the porch, her heart beating a strange rhythm. She'd come to depend on Vaughn's presence, his quiet strength and unwavering support. The thought of him leaving after the drive was completed left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. But that was a worry for another day. Tomorrow, they would begin the cattle drive that would determine the fate of the Double M and perhaps her own future as well. Dawn broke with a chorus of roosters and the clatter of activity as the Double M Ranch hands prepared to move out. Hazel, dressed in practical riding clothes with her hair braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, supervised the final preparations from the porch. Vaughn approached, leading her horse, saddled and ready. "Everything's set," he reported. Hank's already headed to the north pasture with Tobias to start gathering the herd. Hazel nodded, trying to quell the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Miguel has the chuck wagon." "Yes, madam, he'll follow once we get the herd moving." Vaughn studied her face, having second thoughts. "No," Hazel said firmly. "Just acknowledging the stakes. This drive has to succeed, Vaughn." "It will," he assured her, holding Penny's reins while Hazel mounted. "We've planned for every contingency and we have good men with us." They rode side by side toward the north pasture, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the land. Hazel couldn't help but think of the countless times she'd ridden this same trail with her father, learning the ranching business at his side. "You're thinking about him," Vaughn observed quietly. Hazel glanced over, surprised by his perception. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look," he explained. "A mix of sadness and pride. It's how I used to look when thinking of my pa." The simple understanding in his voice touched Hazel deeply. Most people avoided mentioning her father, unsure how to navigate her grief. Vaughn, however, acknowledged it naturally without awkwardness or pity. "He would have liked you," she said spontaneously. "Pa had a good sense about people. Said you could tell a man's character by how he treats animals, children, and those who can do nothing for him." Vaughn's lips curved in a half-smile. "And how do I measure up on that scale?" "Quite well, actually," Hazel admitted. "I've seen you with the horses, and you've helped us when there was nothing in it for you initially." "Perhaps there was something in it for me after all," Vaughn replied cryptically, urging his horse forward as they approached the pasture. The scene before them was organized chaos as Hank and Tobias worked to gather the scattered cattle. The animals, sensing something unusual was happening, lowed nervously and moved in uncertain patterns. Vaughn immediately rode to assist, calling directions that somehow cut through the noise and confusion. Hazel watched in admiration as he seamlessly integrated himself into the operation, his natural authority evident in the way both men and beasts responded to him. By mid-morning, they had the herd 57 head of prime beef cattle gathered and moving southward toward the trail that would eventually lead them to Abilene. Hazel rode flank, keeping strays from wandering off, while Vaughn and Hank alternated at point position. Tobias brought up the rear, with Miguel following in the chuck wagon once they were underway. The first day passed without major incident, though the pace was slower than Hazel had hoped. The cattle, unused to traveling long distances, required frequent breaks and careful handling. By evening, when they made camp beside a small creek, they had covered only 8 miles. "We'll pick up the pace tomorrow," Vaughn assured her as they gathered around the campfire after dinner. "First day's always the slowest. They'll find their rhythm." Hank nodded agreement. "We're still on schedule, Miss Hazel. No need to worry yet." The night watches were divided among them, with Hazel insisting on taking her turn despite Hank's protests. "I'm part of this drive, same as any of you," she said firmly. "I'll take my watch like everyone else." When her turn came in the early morning hours, Hazel circled the bedded-down herd slowly on horseback, alert for any signs of restlessness. The night was clear, with a waning moon providing just enough light to see by. The rhythmic sound of cattle breathing and occasionally shifting in their sleep was oddly soothing. She was halfway through her watch when Vaughn appeared beside her, his horse moving silently over the grass. "Couldn't sleep?" Hazel asked quietly. "Thought you might like some company," he replied. "Nights can get long when you're riding circle alone." They rode together in comfortable silence for a while, the vast expanse of stars overhead creating a sense of both insignificance and possibility. "I used to do this with my father," Hazel eventually said. "Night watch, I mean. He said you could learn more about a cow's nature at night than during the day." "Your father was right," Vaughn agreed. "Animals show their true character when they think no one's watching, people too, for that matter. Hazel glanced at him curiously. And what does your true character look like, Vaughn Blackwood, when no one's watching? The question hung between them, more serious than she'd intended. Vaughn was quiet for so long that Hazel thought he might not answer. I'd like to think I'm the same man whether anyone's watching or not, he finally said. But we all have parts of ourselves we keep hidden, don't we? Before Hazel could respond, a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. They both turned to see clouds building on the horizon, illuminated occasionally by flashes of lightning. Storm's coming, Vaughn observed, his expression turning concerned. Might hit us by tomorrow evening. Will it delay us? Hazel asked, worry creeping into her voice. Depends on how bad it gets, Vaughn replied honestly. Cattle don't mind a light rain, but thunder and lightning can spook them. We'll need to be vigilant. The storm arrived sooner than expected, rolling in by late afternoon the next day. Dark clouds blotted out the sun, and the air grew heavy with the scent of impending rain. The cattle grew increasingly restless, sensing the change in pressure. We need to find a place to hold them, Vaughn called to Hazel over the rising wind. Somewhere with natural boundaries to help contain them if they spook. Hazel nodded, scanning the landscape. There's a bend in the creek about a mile ahead with higher ground on 3 sides. We've used it before during drives. Vaughn relayed the information to Hank, and they quickened the pace, trying to reach the natural enclosure before the worst of the storm hit. They were still half a mile away when the first heavy drops began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The effect on the herd was instantaneous. Several steers at the front bellowed in alarm and veered sharply to the right. Within seconds, the orderly procession dissolved into chaos as panic spread through the herd. They're breaking, Hank shouted, spurring his horse to head off the leaders. Vaughn immediately took charge. Hazel, stay with Tobias on the left flank. Miguel, bring the wagon around to block that side. Hank and I will try to turn the leaders. Hazel urged Penny forward, rain lashing her face as she rode hard to get ahead of the scattering cattle. The ground had quickly turned muddy, making footing treacherous for both horses and cattle. A flash of lightning revealed several steers breaking away to her left, and she wheeled to intercept them. Through the curtain of rain, she could make out Vaughn and Hank working desperately to turn the main body of the herd. Vaughn's hat had blown off, his dark hair plastered to his head as he rode fearlessly into the path of the frightened animals, somehow commanding enough presence to make them veer away from him. For nearly an hour, they fought against both elements and animals, gradually regaining control of the scattered herd. By the time the storm began to abate, they had managed to gather most of the cattle into the protected bend of the creek Hazel had suggested. Exhausted and soaked to the skin, Hazel dismounted near the chuck wagon, where Miguel was attempting to start a fire despite the wet conditions. How many did we lose? She asked as Vaughn approached, leading his mud-spattered horse. 8 broke away completely, he reported grimly. Hank and Tobias are still out looking, but in this weather. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Finding the strays in the gathering darkness after the confusion of the stampede would be challenging at best. Hazel nodded, accepting the news with outward calm despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. 8 cattle represented a significant loss both in terms of potential profit and their tight schedule. We'll search again at first light, Vaughn assured her, noting her concern. They couldn't have gone far. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by mud and standing water. Hank and Tobias had returned during the night, having found 3 of the missing steers. The remaining 5 were presumed lost for good. We're still on schedule, barely, Vaughn told Hazel as they prepared to move out. But we can't afford any more delays or losses. The next several days passed without major incident, though the muddy conditions slowed their progress. Each night, Hazel recalculated their position and timing, the margin for error growing increasingly slim. On the 6th day of the drive, they encountered another obstacle, a swollen creek that had breached its banks after the storm. What should have been a simple crossing had become a dangerous challenge. We can't risk it, Hank declared after scouting the crossing. Current's too strong. We'd lose half the herd trying to force them across. What are our options? Hazel asked, looking to Vaughn. He studied the map they'd been following. There's another crossing about 5 miles upstream, but it would add at least a day to our journey. Which we can't afford, Hazel finished for him, the reality of their situation sinking in. If they delayed much longer, they wouldn't reach Abilene in time to make the bank payment. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, considering alternatives. There might be a third option, he finally said. If we can find a narrower point in the creek, we could fell some trees to create a makeshift bridge. It won't help the cattle cross, but it would allow Miguel to get the chuck wagon over while we take the herd to the upper crossing. Splitting up, Hank frowned. That's risky with so few hands. It's riskier to miss our deadline, Hazel pointed out. If Miguel can get the wagon across and continue toward Abilene, he could reach the stockyards ahead of us and make arrangements. That might save us crucial time at the other end. After further discussion, they agreed to Vaughn's plan. By midday, they had located a suitable spot and felled 2 sturdy trees to create a rough bridge. Miguel successfully navigated the chuck wagon across, taking with him written authorization from Hazel to negotiate on behalf of the Double M. The remaining 4 continued with the herd toward the upstream crossing, pushing the cattle harder than before to make up for lost time. The animals were tired, as were their handlers, but there was no choice but to press on. That evening, as they made camp, Hazel noticed Vaughn wincing slightly as he dismounted. "Are you hurt?" she asked, concerned. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "Old injury acting up after too many hours in the saddle." Hazel wasn't convinced. "Let me see." Reluctantly, Vaughn rolled up his sleeve to reveal a long scar running down his forearm, the skin around it reddened and swollen. "That doesn't look like nothing," Hazel said, gently examining the arm. "How did this happen?" "Knife fight few years back," Vaughn admitted. "Fellow took exception to losing at cards. Normally doesn't bother me, but sometimes in damp weather." Hazel frowned at the casual reference to violence, a reminder that there was much about Vaughn's past she didn't know. "Wait here," she instructed, heading to her saddlebags. She returned with a small tin of salve. "My father swore by this for aches and old wounds," she explained, opening the container. "May I?" Vaughn nodded, extending his arm. Hazel applied the pungent ointment with gentle fingers, acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment. His skin was warm beneath her touch, the muscles of his forearm firm and well-defined. "Thank you," Vaughn said quietly when she finished, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your father raised a compassionate daughter." "He raised me to care for those who care for me," Hazel replied softly. "You've done more for the Double M than I could have asked." For a moment, it seemed as though Vaughn might say something more, but Hank approached with coffee, breaking the moment. The next morning brought new challenges as they reached the upstream crossing. Though less swollen than the lower section, the creek was still running high and fast. Crossing the cattle would be dangerous but necessary. Vaughn took the lead, riding ahead to test the depth and current before they attempted to move the herd. Finding it passable, though barely, they began the delicate process of coaxing the cattle into the water. Hazel watched anxiously from the bank as the first steers entered the creek, their footing uncertain on the slippery bottom. Vaughn and Hank rode alongside the leaders, guiding them toward the opposite shore, while Tobias kept the remainder of the herd moving forward. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck when one of the lead steers lost its footing and was swept downstream. Others began to balk, threatening to turn back and cause confusion. Without hesitation, Vaughn urged his horse deeper into the current, somehow managing to head off the panicking animal and redirect it toward shore. By the time the last of the herd had crossed safely, all 4 riders were soaked and exhausted, but triumphant. They had overcome yet another obstacle, though at the cost of several hours' delay. "We can still make it," Vaughn assured Hazel as they continued their journey. "If we push hard the next 2 days, we'll reach Abilene with a day to spare." Hazel nodded, trying to maintain her optimism despite the growing fatigue evident in both humans and animals. They had come too far to fail now. The final days of the drive tested their endurance to the limit. They rose before dawn and continued until after dusk, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the cattle. Every member of the small crew took on extra duties, snatching sleep in brief shifts when possible. Through it all, Vaughn remained a steady presence, his quiet confidence bolstering the others when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. More than once, Hazel found strength in his unwavering belief that they would succeed. On the morning of the 11th day, they crested a rise to see Abilene spread before them in the distance, the railroad tracks gleaming in the early sunlight. A cheer went up from the tired drovers at the sight. "We made it," Hazel breathed, relief washing over her. Vaughn rode up beside her, a smile breaking across his weary face. Never doubted it for a moment. As they approached the outskirts of town, they were met by Miguel, who had indeed succeeded in arranging everything with the stockyards. The cattle would be weighed and processed immediately, with payment to follow. By late afternoon, Hazel stood in the office of the Abilene Bank, counting out the proceeds from the sale. Despite the loss of 5 head and the lower than hoped-for weight of some animals, they had cleared enough to cover the mortgage payment with a small margin to spare. "Would you like to wire the payment directly to the Sweetwater Bank?" the clerk asked. Hazel considered this, then shook her head. "No, thank you. I'd prefer to deliver it in person." There was something deeply satisfying about the thought of placing the money in Harold Simmons' hands herself. The next morning, Hazel prepared to board the eastbound train that would take her back to Sweetwater, while the men would follow more slowly with the wagon and horses. As she waited on the platform, Vaughn approached. "Everything settled?" he asked. "Yes," Hazel confirmed. "The payment's secure, and I've left funds for supplies for your return journey." Vaughn nodded, seeming unusually hesitant. "Hazel, before you go, I wanted to ask what your plans are, for after the payment, I mean." The question caught her off guard. In the rush of the cattle drive, she hadn't thought much beyond making the bank payment. "Continue running the ranch, I suppose. Why do you ask?" "I was wondering if you might need a permanent foreman," Vaughn said carefully. "Hank mentioned he's been thinking of retiring, moving to San Antonio to be near his daughter." Hazel stared at him, processing this unexpected information. "Hank's retiring. He hasn't said anything to me. He didn't want to burden you with it until after the drive," Vaughn explained. "But he spoke to me about it a few nights ago, asked if I might be interested in taking over when he leaves." The implications of this revelation swirled through Hazel's mind. Hank had been a constant at the Double M for so long, she could hardly imagine the ranch without him. Yet the thought of Vaughn staying on, becoming a permanent part of her life. "And are you?" she asked, her heart beating faster. "Interested, I mean." Vaughn's blue eyes held her steadily. "Very much so, if you'll have me." The train whistle blew, signaling the imminent departure. Hazel knew she needed to board, yet she was reluctant to leave this conversation unfinished. "We'll discuss it when you return," she promised. "But yes, I think I would like that very much." A smile broke across Vaughn's face, transforming his features with a brightness that took Hazel's breath away. "Then I'll see you in Sweetwater, Miss Montgomery." As the train pulled away from the station, Hazel watched Vaughn standing on the platform until he faded from view. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a sense of anticipation for the future, a future that might include Vaughn Blackwood as more than just her foreman. 3 days later, Hazel stood in Harold Simmons' office, savoring the banker's poorly concealed surprise as she counted out the mortgage payment in full. "This is unexpected, Miss Montgomery," Simmons admitted, quickly recovering his composure. "I must say I had my doubts about your ability to continue your father's business." "So you mentioned," Hazel replied coolly. "I trust this payment addresses those concerns." Simmons cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes, well, for the time being. The board will still need to review the overall loan situation, of course." "Of course," Hazel agreed pleasantly. "When they do, they might want to consider that the Double M delivered 52 head of prime beef cattle to market on schedule, despite adverse weather conditions and with limited personnel. I believe that demonstrates sound management, wouldn't you agree?" Unable to argue with the facts, Simmons reluctantly provided Hazel with a receipt for the payment and assurances that the loan would continue under the original terms. As she left the bank, Hazel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The immediate threat to the ranch had been averted, though she harbored no illusions that Simmons and his colleagues would suddenly view her as an equal. That battle would continue, but at least she had won this round. For the next week, Hazel divided her time between the ranch and town, overseeing repairs that had been neglected during their absence and restocking supplies. Each day, she found herself watching the Eastern Road, anticipating the return of Vaughn and the others. When they finally arrived, dust-covered and weary from their journey, Hazel was waiting in the yard. Her eyes immediately sought Vaughn, who rode slightly ahead of the others. He smiled when he saw her, and something warm unfurled in Hazel's chest. That evening, after the men had rested and cleaned up, Hazel invited Vaughn to join her on the porch. The spring evening was mild, with fireflies beginning to emerge in the gathering dusk. "I spoke with Hank," Hazel said after they had exchanged news of their respective journeys. "He confirmed what you told me about his plans to retire." Vaughn nodded. "He's earned his rest, said he'd stay on long enough to break in his replacement if you found one." "I believe I have," Hazel replied, meeting his gaze directly, "if you're still interested in the position." "I am," Vaughn confirmed without hesitation. "Very much so." Hazel smiled, relief and something more warming her. "Then consider yourself hired, Mr. Blackwood. We can discuss terms tomorrow, but I believe we can match whatever you've earned elsewhere." "The terms aren't important," Vaughn said quietly. "It's the opportunity I value." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "There's something else I should tell you," Vaughn finally said, his tone growing serious. "Something about why I was in Sweetwater that day we met." Hazel turned to look at him, curious and slightly apprehensive. "Yes, I wasn't just passing through by chance," Vaughn admitted. "I came looking for a man named Liam Reeves." The name sent a shock through Hazel. "Liam. Why would you be looking for him?" Vaughn's expression hardened slightly. "Because I've been tracking the gang he rides with for the past 6 months. They robbed a bank in Missouri last fall, killed the teller, a woman I knew." He paused, then added quietly, "She was to be my wife." Hazel stared at him, struggling to process this revelation. "You're a bounty hunter?" "No," Vaughn shook his head. "Not officially. I was a deputy in a small town near the Missouri-Kansas border. After Mary was killed, I resigned my badge and went after the gang on my own. Followed their trail across 3 states. And it led you to Sweetwater," Hazel whispered, understanding dawning. "To the day my father was killed," Vaughn nodded grimly. "I arrived too late. By the time I rode into town, the robbery was already over, your father." He trailed off, not needing to finish the terrible sentence. "I asked around, heard about what happened, learned that the sheriff's daughter had witnessed it all. I was going to call on you formally, ask what you'd seen, but then I found you at the cemetery instead." Hazel's mind raced, connecting pieces that suddenly made sense: Vaughn's reluctance to share details of his past, his immediate understanding of her grief, his willingness to help save the ranch. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, unable to keep a note of hurt from her voice. "At first I didn't want to add to your burden," Vaughn explained. "You were grieving and I found myself wanting to help you, not question you. Later, as we worked together, it never seemed the right time." He looked at her directly, his blue eyes earnest. "I should have told you sooner." "I'm sorry for that." Hazel processed this information slowly, sorting through her feelings. Part of her was angry at the deception, however well-intentioned, yet another part understood his reasons all too well. "What do you intend to do now?" she finally asked. "About Liam and the others." "I've been in contact with the Rangers," Vaughn replied. "Shared what I know about the gang's patterns, likely hideouts. They're closing in on them from what I hear." "And when they're caught, will you leave to see justice done?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Vaughn seemed to consider his answer carefully. "I need to see it through," he admitted. "Need to know they've answered for what they've done to Mary, to your father, to others. But..." He paused, reaching tentatively for her hand. "I'd like to come back afterward, if you'll still have me." Hazel looked down at their joined hands, his larger one enveloping hers with gentle strength. The revelation of his past should have made her wary, yet somehow it had the opposite effect. Vaughn Blackwood had suffered loss just as she had, understood grief and the need for closure. His quest for justice wasn't so different from her own desire to see her father's killers brought to account. "I understand needing to finish what you started," she said softly. "But yes, Vaughn. I'd like you to come back." She met his gaze steadily. The Double M needs a foreman who cares about more than just a paycheck. Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, a mixture of relief and something deeper, more personal. "And is it only the ranch that needs me, Hazel?" The directness of the question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. From their first meeting, there had been an honesty between them that transcended conventional social boundaries. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not only the ranch." Vaughn's hand tightened around hers, and he leaned closer, his eyes seeking permission that Hazel granted with a slight nod. His lips met hers with gentle firmness, a promise rather than a demand. Hazel found herself responding naturally, her free hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. When they parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "I've wanted to do that since I saw you smile for the first time at the cemetery," he confessed. Hazel felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I'm glad you waited until now," she replied with a small laugh. "It would have been rather forward at our first meeting." The jest lightened the moment, though the connection between them remained stronger than before. As night settled fully around the ranch, they continued talking, sharing stories of their pasts and tentative hopes for the future, a future that, for the first time since her father's death, Hazel found herself eagerly anticipating. 2 weeks later, news arrived that changed everything. Sheriff Daniels rode out to the Double M early one morning, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "They got them," he announced without preamble as Hazel met him in the yard. "Rangers cornered the Reeves gang near the Mexican border yesterday. There was a shootout." Hazel's heart stuttered, and 3 dead, including Liam Reeves, 2 captured alive. The sheriff watched her reaction carefully. "Thought you'd want to know, given your father's involvement." "Thank you for bringing the news," Hazel said, her emotions conflicted. There was relief that justice had been served, sorrow for the boy Liam had once been, and concern for how Vaughn would receive this news. As if summoned by her thoughts, Vaughn emerged from the barn, immediately reading the situation. He approached, nodding a greeting to the sheriff. "They got the gang," Sheriff Daniels repeated for Vaughn's benefit. "Reeves is dead." Vaughn absorbed this information silently, his expression unreadable. "The others," he finally asked, "being transported to Austin for trial. They'll hang, no doubt about it." After the sheriff departed, Hazel and Vaughn walked together toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the ranch property. Neither spoke until they reached the shade of a large cottonwood tree. "How do you feel?" Hazel asked gently. Vaughn considered the question seriously. "I thought I'd feel satisfaction," he admitted. "Or relief, at least, but mostly I feel empty." He looked at her, a vulnerability in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Hazel nodded. "When Pa first died, I thought finding his killers would ease the pain." "But justice doesn't bring them back, does it?" "No," Vaughn agreed softly. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "But maybe it lets us move forward without looking back so often." They stood together in the dappled shade, the gentle sound of flowing water creating a peaceful backdrop to their contemplation. Hazel felt Vaughn's arm slip around her waist, drawing her against his side in a gesture that felt both protective and seeking comfort. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning into him. "Now," Vaughn said thoughtfully, "I believe I promised to help Hank repair the north fence line today." A smile touched his lips. "And then I thought I might take you into town for dinner if you're amenable." The deliberate ordinariness of his answer made Hazel laugh softly. "That sounds perfect." In the days that followed, life at the Double M settled into a new rhythm. Vaughn officially took over more of Hank's duties as the older man began training him in the specific requirements of the ranch. Hazel focused on the business aspects, negotiating contracts for the fall cattle sale and reviewing the ranch's finances with a keen eye toward improvements. Their relationship developed naturally alongside their professional partnership. Evenings were often spent on the porch, discussing the day's events and making plans for the ranch's future. Sometimes these conversations led to more personal topics, shared memories, hopes, and gradually, tentative plans for a shared future. A month after the news of the gang's capture, Vaughn found Hazel in the garden behind the house, harvesting late spring vegetables. He approached with a purposeful stride that caught her attention immediately. "Hazel," he began, unusually formal, "I've been thinking." She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "That sounds serious." "It is," Vaughn confirmed, a hint of nervousness in his typically confident demeanor. "I've been offered the position of sheriff in Sweetwater." The news surprised Hazel. "Sheriff Daniels is leaving. Moving to Dallas to be with his son," Vaughn explained. "The town council approached me yesterday, given my previous experience as a deputy. They asked if I'd consider taking the badge." Hazel absorbed this information, trying to interpret how Vaughn felt about the offer. "And would you?" "Consider it, I mean." Vaughn's expression grew serious. "That depends entirely on you, Hazel, on me. Why would my opinion matter for your career decision?" "Because," Vaughn said, stepping closer and taking her hands in his, "I wouldn't want a position that takes me away from you and the ranch." "Not unless." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Not unless you were my wife and we faced it together." Hazel stared at him, her heart suddenly racing. "Vaughn Blackwood, are you proposing to me in my vegetable garden?" A smile broke across his face, transforming his serious expression. "I reckon I am, though I'd planned something more romantic." Got thrown off course when the council made their offer. Laughing, Hazel squeezed his hands. "Only you would think a marriage proposal is something that gets thrown off course like a stray calf." "Is that a yes?" Vaughn asked, his blue eyes hopeful. Instead of answering immediately, Hazel raised herself on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a tender kiss. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "1,000 times yes." Vaughn's arms encircled her waist, lifting her slightly as he returned the kiss with enthusiastic affection. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "So, Sheriff Blackwood," Hazel teased, "how will you manage both the law in town and the ranch?" "Well, Mrs. Soon to be Blackwood," Vaughn replied, matching her playful tone. "I figure between your business sense and my badge, we'll keep both Sweetwater and the Double M running smoothly. Tobias is ready for more responsibility here, and Miguel's learning fast." The practical considerations of their future would need to be addressed. But for now, standing in the sunlit garden with Vaughn's arms around her, Hazel felt only joy and anticipation. 6 weeks ago, she had sat by her father's grave, consumed by grief and uncertainty. Now she stood in the garden he had planted, embracing a future filled with promise and love. "My father would have approved," she said softly. "I like to think so," Vaughn agreed. He raised an extraordinary daughter, one who faced down bankers, led cattle drives, and somehow saw something worth keeping in a drifter who laid flowers on a stranger's grave. "The flowers were a good start," Hazel admitted with a smile. "But it was staying until I smiled that truly won my heart." 2 months later, on a perfect late summer day, Hazel Montgomery became Hazel Blackwood in a ceremony held under the cottonwood tree by the creek. The entire town of Sweetwater turned out for the occasion, eager to celebrate their new sheriff and the daughter of their former one. Sheriff Vaughn Blackwood, resplendent in a new suit, waited nervously beneath the tree as Hazel approached on Hank's arm. Her simple white dress, adorned with lace her mother had saved for this very occasion, caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves above. As they exchanged vows before the assembled guests, Hazel thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, from tears at a cemetery to smiles beside a creek, from strangers to partners in all things. Grief had opened the door to their meeting, but love had transformed it into something enduring and beautiful. Later, as they danced beneath lanterns strung from the ranch house porch, Vaughn pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "Happy Mrs. Blackwood." "More than I ever thought possible again," Hazel replied honestly, her arms encircling his neck. "And you, Sheriff Blackwood?" Vaughn's blue eyes, so serious when they first met, crinkled with happiness as he smiled down at her. I found what I was looking for when I started drifting west all those years ago. Turns out it was you, I just didn't know it yet." As night fell over the Double M, bringing with it a canopy of stars and the gentle sounds of the Texas night, Hazel and Vaughn slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand toward their future, a future built on flowers laid in sorrow and the smile that had followed, promising healing, hope, and love that would endure through all the seasons to come. 5 years later, Hazel stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching as Vaughn lifted their 3-year-old daughter, Grace, onto her first pony. Their son, James, named for Hazel's father, clung to her skirts, eagerly awaiting his turn though he was barely 2. "Easy now," Vaughn instructed Grace, his voice gentle but firm. "Remember what I told you about holding the reins." Grace nodded solemnly, her dark curls so like her father's bouncing with the movement. Her blue eyes, also inherited from Vaughn, narrowed in concentration as she gripped the small leather reins in her tiny hands. "I'm ready, Papa," she announced with determination that reminded Hazel so much of herself. Vaughn led the pony in a small circle, never letting go of the lead rope while keeping a steadying hand on Grace's back. The little girl's face broke into a delighted smile as the pony moved, and she let out a peal of laughter that echoed across the ranch yard. "Mama, look," she called to Hazel. "I'm riding." "I see you, sweetheart," Hazel called back, her heart full to bursting with love for her family. "You're doing wonderfully." Little James tugged at her skirt. "Me ride too, Mama," he demanded, his toddler voice insistent. "When you're a bit bigger, darling," Hazel promised, bending to scoop him into her arms. "For now, we'll watch your sister." The Double M had flourished in the years since Hazel and Vaughn's marriage. With Vaughn serving as sheriff in town and overseeing the ranch operations when his duties allowed, and Hazel managing the business aspects, they had expanded both their herd and their property. The mortgage was now fully paid, and they employed 6 ranch hands year-round, with more during busy seasons. Vaughn had proven himself an excellent sheriff, firm but fair, earning the respect of everyone in Sweetwater. More importantly to Hazel, he was a devoted husband and father, returning each evening from town eager to spend time with his family. As Grace's riding lesson concluded, Vaughn lifted her from the pony and set her gently on the ground. She immediately ran to Hazel, her face flushed with excitement. "Did you see, Mama? I didn't fall off even once." "You were very brave," Hazel assured her, shifting James to her hip so she could caress her daughter's cheek. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." Grace nodded solemnly. Though she had never met James Montgomery, Hazel and Vaughn had made sure both children knew about the man who had built the Double M and whose legacy they continued. "Can we go visit Grandpa's grave tomorrow?" Grace asked. "I want to tell him about my riding." Hazel exchanged a glance with Vaughn, who had joined them on the porch after returning the pony to the corral. These visits to the cemetery had become a family tradition, not mournful occasions, but rather celebrations of the man whose life had, in a roundabout way, brought them all together. "I think that's a fine idea," Vaughn agreed, ruffling Grace's hair affectionately. "We'll take some of those wildflowers from the creek bed, the purple ones your mama likes. And the yellow ones too," Grace added decisively. "Grandpa likes both kinds." As the children ran off to play, Vaughn slipped his arm around Hazel's waist, drawing her against his side. 5 years, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you sitting by that grave." "And sometimes it feels like you've always been here," Hazel replied, leaning into his embrace. "As if my life truly began the day you laid those flowers and waited for me to smile." "Best thing I ever did," Vaughn said with quiet certainty, waiting for that smile. As the sun began its descent over the Texas plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Hazel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief had come joy beyond measure, a thriving ranch, 2 beautiful children, and a love that continued to deepen with each passing day. Tomorrow they would visit her father's grave, not with tears but with flowers and stories of the life they had built together. And as they had each time before, they would leave with smiles, carrying forward the legacy of love that had begun in sorrow but blossomed into happiness that would endure for generations to come.